I am absolutely thrilled to introduce our next session, which is going to build on some of the research findings that we explored in our previous session through the dual lenses of both the social sciences and the fine arts. To Survive on This Shore is a richly detailed portraiture and interview project by photographer Jess T. Dugan and social worker Vanessa Fabbre that highlights the diverse lived experiences of transgender older adults. You can learn more about these distinguished collaborators in the speaker biographies packet, but I'll give very brief introductions too. Jess T. Dugan is an artist whose work explores identity through photography, video, and writing. Their work is regularly exhibited internationally and is in the permanent collections of over 50 museums. They are the recipient of a Pollock-Krasner Foundation grant and an ICP Infinity Award, and were selected by the Obama White House as an LGBT Artist Champion of Change. Dr. Vanessa Fabbre is a licensed social worker and associate professor of social work at the Brown School at Washington University in St. Louis, where she is also affiliate faculty member in the Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, the Institute for Public Health, and the Catherine M. Buder Center for American Indian Studies. Dr. Fabre's research focuses on the conditions under which queer and trans people age well. During Jess and Vanessa's talk, once again, I invite everyone in the audience to share their questions in the chat so that we can return to them at the Q&A session at the end of their presentation. And reminder also to keep your mics muted just to minimize any background noise while the presentation is happening. Jess and Vanessa, thank you so much for being part of the Creative Aging Institute. It's really a delight to have you. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Susan, and hi, everyone. We are delighted to be here with you all today. Can you hear us okay? Yes, perfect. Okay. Yes, thank you so much for having us. Today, we are going to present our project To Survive on the Shore, and we are physically in the same place. So we're going to do a little slide in and out of the screen here. Right. And I'm going to begin by presenting the work from the project, talking about how we made it, how it exists in the world, and then I'll hand it over to Vanessa, and she will speak more about the research side and some of the findings, hopefully the ones that are particularly of interest to you all. So that's how we're going to go. So we're going to do our little slide over here. Only one of our chairs has wheels, so we'll do our best. And give me 1 second here, and I will share my screen. Okay, can you all see that okay?
Looks good.
Yeah. Looks good. Excellent. All right. So we will jump right in. So To Survive on This Shore, Photographs and Interviews with Transgender and Gender Nonconforming Older Adults is a collaborative interdisciplinary project. We made this body of work between 2013 and 2018. We ultimately photographed and interviewed 88 participants throughout the United States, and our age range was 50. We set 50 as our minimum, and then our oldest participant was 90. So from the very beginning of this project, we were committed to seeking a diverse group of subjects. We were really committed to and passionate about building in diversity from the very beginning, and not just sort of photographing and interviewing the people we knew and then trying to add diversity later. So that was really built into the fabric of the project. And we sought diversity in terms of race and ethnicity, gender identity and expression. We very intentionally sought people who identified as male to female, as well as female to male, but also people who identified as gender nonconforming, gender queer, whatever language that they used as non-binary. We felt really strongly about including a wide range of identities in the project. We also sought diversity in terms of socioeconomic status, geographic location. So we went all over the United States. We went to both coasts. We went to big cities. We went to small towns. We were really trying to seek out diversity in terms of geography. And then we also sought diversity in terms of lived experience. So some of the people in the project transitioned very early in 1970 or 1971. Other people had transitioned in 2015 or 2016, right before we met them. So we really sought out different stories. And then, of course, other participants didn't transition at all for either personal reasons or medical reasons. So we were really seeking out a very broad and diverse group of people in every way that we could think of. I'm lingering here because this is Gloria. Gloria was one of my favorite portraits. She was a very well-known activist in the Chicago area, and she worked at the Center on Halsted, Chicago's LGBTQ center, where she ran a charm school for young trans folks, and particularly young trans women of color, where she would teach them how to be a lady. So she was very beloved, and later in her life, she was taking up stand-up comedy. There's a Broadway play written about her. There's a documentary film about her life. So some of the people that we sought to include were very beloved and very well-known people within the community. So the majority of the people that we photographed and interviewed, we met specifically for this project, but there were a few exceptions. And Hank and Sam are one of those exceptions. I actually grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas. And when I was a kid, Sam here on the right ran a lesbian Bible study group that my mom went to. And I was very young, so my memory of this Bible study group was mostly that they had really good snacks and they had 3 Boston Terriers. I think they were named Butch, Blue Jean, and Girlfriend. So I remember that the most. But when we were making this project, I thought of them and I reached out to them and I said, you know, I don't know how you identify, but we're working on this project. Would you like to be part of it? And they said, yes, of course. And so Vanessa and I drove down to Little Rock and we spent the day with them. And I was really struck by a couple of things. One was that Hank and I had a very similar internal identity. I used the language of queer and non-binary. But because of our generational difference, our experiences in the world were so profoundly different, and the ease with which I could live my life was not something that Hank had. And so that really hit home for me. And then the other thing that was really touching was that they both had breast cancer later in life, and they both had double mastectomies. And even though, of course, those experiences were very difficult, they were ecstatic to have flat chests later in life. And so at the end of our day together, we ended up all comparing our chest surgery scars and talking about our experiences. And I share that because the process of making these interviews, in many cases, led to such closeness and such intimacy. We would often show up either near strangers or complete strangers, and the people that we were meeting with would share with us their most joyful life stories, their most difficult life stories. And over the course of a few hours, sometimes the full day, we would leave just feeling incredibly close to one another. So I know that's something that we both value about this project. And I think the participants really valued having the opportunity to share those stories in a way that would be preserved and made public and put to use. These are Hank's hats. The third one in says, "Dysfunctional veteran, leave me alone." This is Sky, who I photographed in Palm Springs, California. And I actually photographed him first, and then I had the opportunity to return a year later and photograph him with his partner. This is Sky and Mike. Most trans men I meet are very jealous of their ability to grow such significant beards. This is DeSanti in New Mexico, and we always conducted the interview prior to making the photograph, and this was important for a couple of reasons. One is it really allowed us and the subjects to get to know one another. It allowed us all to kind of settle into this new relationship, and it allowed me, you know, particularly when Vanessa was doing the interview, it allowed me to watch the person, to think about how they sat, how they gestured, how they held their hands, and this was all information that I could put into the portrait. But the other thing is people often shared things in the interview that I could literally incorporate into the portrait. So DeSanti shared that he had always been a musician. He was a musician his whole life, and he had fairly significant struggles with substance abuse and mental health prior to transitioning. And music was really the thing that he felt had saved him, that got him through. And so he actually showed up to the photo shoot with several different guitars. This was at his mother's house in Santa Fe, and he brought several of his guitars so that I could choose one for the photograph. So conducting the interview first was really helpful in kind of tailoring the portrait to really match the person. This is Duchess in Los Angeles. This is another one of my favorite portraits. This is Jude in California. So I mentioned we sought diversity in terms of life narrative, and Jude was a really good example of this because he transitioned in 1971 and was one of the first really out visible trans men that people knew of. And what was interesting is throughout the project, other trans men would reference Jude as the first person they had ever seen or the first person they had known of. So even within this group of people, transgender older adults, which the general public often assumes to be monolithic, there was such diversity and there were so many layers of reference. And so it was really interesting for us to kind of capture these different historical layers of influence, even within this demographic. So this is Jude when he was 32. He was holding a picture of himself. And then this is Bobby in Michigan. This is another example of incorporating something into the portrait that really helped to tell her story. She had had a very high profile and long career in the military. And when we entered her home in Detroit, it was full of planes and flags and other military paraphernalia. And I felt really strongly that it was important to include some of that in her portrait. This is Suki in New York. This is Tony in San Diego. This is Aiden in Washington State. Aiden is actually the founder of the Gender Odyssey Conference, which is a fairly well-known conference, and he works a lot with trans youth. And I'll talk a little bit later about us going to some trans conferences, including Aiden's. This is Caprice in Chicago. And this is one of my favorite portraits in the project too, although I'm fairly certain that Caprice conceived of this entire setting and portrait before we showed up because everything was perfectly laid out, perfectly color coordinated. So she made my job very easy. Caprice was also a very well-known activist in the Chicago area. And this is Grace. So Grace is the other person I knew prior to making this work. I grew up, after Little Rock, I grew up in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And Grace is the executive director of the Boston Alliance of Gay and Lesbian Youth. And I think she's going on 40 years of having been the executive director there. So she's very well known. She's a very significant activist in the Boston area. And she was someone I had known since I was a teenager. So this is actually one of the first portraits we made. And I'm going to read you Grace's quote just to give you a sense of the kind of quotes that go along with each portrait. Each image has a quote that accompanies it in both exhibition space and in the book, which I'll talk about as well in a few minutes. So Grace said, oh, I got to move my little Zoom window for a second. Okay. Grace said, I always felt more like girls, like women. Even when I was watching movies or television shows or reading books, the female characters were the ones that I identified with just sort of instinctively. So I knew I was born male, but I certainly was a feminine boy growing up, a genderqueer boy, and was harassed and bullied and got a lot of negative attention because of that. I was assumed to be gay from the earliest get-go as well, even though it wasn't talked about then in the 60s. So I was called all the names associated with that: sissy, faggot, fairy, all of that. I didn't feel like I was transsexual. I didn't have that profound sense of body dysphoria that lots of transsexuals report, even though there were things that I wanted to change. So the way I understood that and was able to express that in the 80s was maybe what we would now call genderqueer. That term wasn't used then, but I lived in another gender space. I just was living in this third gender space. I didn't see it as on my way to anything. I've been lucky to have people in my life who have been supportive of me in my journey, wherever that would lead me. So it was less about giving me guidance on a specific path and more about people who have said, your identity's evolving, and that's a wonderful thing, and we encourage you to explore that and go with that. I still see myself as on a journey. When I received an award a few years ago at a conference, I said, in the 60s, they called me a sissy. In the 70s, they called me a faggot. In the 80s, I was a queen. In the 90s, I was transgender. In the 2000s, I was a woman. And now I'm just Grace. So I love to share Grace's quote, in part because I just find it incredibly moving, but also because Grace really situates her own personal journey within this larger social and political and historical context. And that was something that we were really interested in when we made this body of work, is we really wanted to capture a certain kind of history that we knew was not being recorded in mainstream ways. And we really wanted to sort of take this snapshot of this very particular political moment and social moment, especially when many of the people we were interviewing and photographing were people who were directly responsible for the activism that I know I was benefiting from. And so we were very passionate about getting that into the work. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we made the project and how we put it to use in the world. So as I mentioned, we started the project in 2013. Vanessa and I met in 2012, and we realized very quickly that even though she was in social work and I was in photography and art, that we had overlapping interests. We had both worked within trans communities previously, and we realized that we could join forces and create a project that addressed this gap in representations that we knew to be true. We both personally knew a lot of transgender older adults, but we knew that there were very few representations of them. And so we decided to come together and make this project. So for the first 2 years, it really spread word of mouth. We began with people we knew. It spread out from there. We did several different outreach efforts as well. So as I mentioned, we would go to some transgender conferences, present the work, meet people there. We would reach out to people within the community and ask for particular activists or people who were important. And then as we would travel, we would also reach out to local LGBTQ nonprofit organizations and ask them to recommend people to photograph. So we had this multi-pronged approach to finding people. And then in 2015, we had this article run in the New York Times, and we actually collaborated fairly intensively with the writer on the article. And then they also used our photographs from the project. And this was another explosive moment of finding people to include in the work. We had hundreds of emails from people all around the country wanting to be included. We had organizations reaching out, wanting to collaborate. So in 2015, the project really took on even more, it built even more and became very national. So this is one of the first exhibitions of the work we had. This is at the Museum of Contemporary Photography in Chicago. And I'm very committed to showing my work in museums. I work primarily with museums, and I believe that museums are a very democratic and powerful avenue for education, for people having very real experiences with work. But at the same time, I also feel really strongly about showing my work outside of museum spaces. And that's something we did, especially with To Survive on This Shore. I do it with all of my work, but in this project, we did it with almost every exhibition we had. So at the same time the work was on view at the Museum of Contemporary Photography, we organized a satellite exhibition at the Center on Halsted, Chicago's LGBTQ center. And it was in this big this big waiting area. So as people would come for therapy appointments or social groups or meetings, they would encounter the work. And it's been really important to both of us to continue to position the work in spaces where people encounter it when they're not necessarily seeking out an art museum or intentionally trying to go see an art exhibition. So in 2018, we made a book. I have the real thing here. And we knew from the very beginning that we wanted to make the project into a book, and felt that a book was a wonderful way to make it more accessible, more democratic, to get it out into the world. However, photography books are still fairly expensive. And so we were committed to giving everyone in the project a copy of the book. And so as we sent the books out, we would get all of these pictures back, selfies of people with the book. We came to learn that people knew what page number they were on, and they felt really proud of being in the book and took a lot of ownership over it. So this was a very, very sweet moment. So in this project, we really centered the stories of the participants. In my other work as an artist, some of my other work as an artist is very subjective and about my experience, but in this project, it was very much about making space for the participants to tell their stories. And so when we started doing book release events and promo events and exhibitions, we really wanted to continue that centering of the participants' voices. So instead of Vanessa and I always giving an artist talk or speaking about the project, we would invite participants to come and share their stories, talk about their experience being part of the work. And so this was one of our book release events at an independent bookstore in Chicago called Women and Children First. And you can see that several of the participants are there at the front with me, really leading the release event. This is an art fair in Chicago called Expo Chicago, and we were there for the weekend, and Gloria came down and spent the day with us. We had a book signing, we had a reception, and it was very sweet because people were mostly interested in Gloria. No one was interested in us, and so she got to be the star for the day and sign lots of books, and it was really, really touching. So as much as possible, we always try to involve people after the fact as well. So when the book came out in 2018, we had another press run. It began with another feature in the New York Times, and the work went, I hesitate to say this because it sounds egotistical, but I'm pretty sure the work went viral. We had this big moment where it got a lot of attention. And for the most part, this was a really wonderful thing because it brought a lot of eyes to the book. It got it on a mainstream level that it hadn't been before, but it also introduced some complications. And this was a Instagram takeover I did for the New Yorker photo account. And you can see on the bottom left, that picture of Sky and Mike had like almost 15,000 likes and 162 comments. So the work kind of quickly exploded to this next level of attention. And part of what came with that was, of course, some negative comments. And I really grappled with how to handle that because I feel such a responsibility to the people I photograph to be careful with how and where the work is presented, to be thoughtful about how it's written about. But on some level, of course, that's out of my hands once it's in the press and in the mainstream. And then I also thought about younger trans people encountering this because part of why we wanted to make this work was for younger trans folks or trans folks who hadn't found their identities or come out yet. We wanted them to have this as something to look towards. And so I was thinking about that young trans kid like encountering this and reading these hateful comments. And so I really grappled with what to do about that. And I reached out to several of the participants and they basically said, we knew this was going to happen. It's fine. Don't worry about it. But, it's tricky, certainly when the internet is involved, things get a little more complicated. This is the first solo exhibition of this work. This was at a gallery in St. Louis called Projects Plus Gallery. And again, whenever we have an exhibition or any kind of event, we try to involve as many of the participants as possible. So this is Steph, who's local to St. Louis. She came to the opening with us. This is John, who lives in a small town in Arkansas. And he was very active with trans communities online, but had actually met very few trans people in person. And so he lived in a very, very small town. And he came up to St. Louis and actually spent the whole weekend with us and met other participants from the project. So that was really touching as well. Whenever we have an exhibition, particularly of this work, we really view the exhibition as the beginning and not the end. And so we try to organize as much programming as we can around the exhibition and put the work to use in as best of a way as we can. So this is a class visit from a social work class at Washington University. And then we also collaborated with 2 local nonprofit organizations to host a storytelling night for LGBTQ folks to come and share their own story. So we really envisioned the gallery and the exhibition as this space where we could make other things happen. This exhibition is continuing to travel. It started here in St. Louis and it's been to 8 museums since its launch in 2018, and it will continue to travel around the country. And then there's other incarnations of this work in different museums, different spaces. This is the Minneapolis Institute of Art, and they actually acquired 8 of the pieces for their permanent collection, and then they mounted them as a solo exhibition. So outside of the official traveling exhibition, there's all these other versions in the museum world. Because our mission with this project was really an educational one and an activist one, I was thinking a lot about how to disseminate the work even more than a typical art museum, typical art exhibition. And so we created this limited edition portfolio that had 12 photographs and interviews. And it was really intended for teaching museums and teaching institutions. It's now been acquired by 10 museums around the country. And this work is regularly used in class visits, in study rooms, in exhibitions. Because the museums have 12 pieces, it allows them to use them a lot more often. They're intentionally a smaller scale, so they're easy to handle, they're easy to use in a classroom setting. So we're always thinking about kind of how to put the work to use in as many ways as we can. And then sometimes museums will acquire the portfolio and then mount it as a solo exhibition, as is the case here. This is a museum in Colorado. And then in addition to the museum exhibition and the portfolio, we created a community exhibition that was meant to be very accessible. It was available to non-art institutions. So this was the first exhibition we had at a synagogue here in St. Louis. And it was actually really sweet because when it ended here, we crated it all up and we literally put it on a cart and we rolled it across the street to a UU church. And that was its second venue. And then it continued on to the social work school at Washington University, and then continued on from there to some other university spaces around the country. So again, we're always thinking about how to put this work in spaces where people will encounter it when they're not necessarily seeking it out. This exhibition is up right now. This is at the SFO Museum in San Francisco, and it's actually the only accredited art museum in an airport in the country, which is kind of amazing. But this will end up, it's up right now through January. It will end up having been a 13-month run. And it's kind of remarkable how many people have passed through and seen it. So again, thinking about just getting the work out there in a way that will be meaningful. So the very last thing I'm going to talk about is the advocacy of the work too. So as I mentioned, of course, we had education and activism and advocacy in mind when we made the work. But another thing we've been very intentional about is putting the work to use in more of an educational capacity or political capacity. And so whenever an organization approaches us and wants to collaborate, we are very happy, and we've worked with quite a few organizations to use the work from To Survive on the Shore. So this was a collaboration we did with a group called Open House. They're an organization working with LGBTQ seniors in the Bay Area. And this was put together to protest the removal of a question relating to sexual orientation and gender in the National Survey of Older Americans Act participants. So they wanted to create this poster campaign, and they looked around and couldn't really find images of older trans folks. And they reached out and asked if they could use our pictures, and we said yes. And then they made this poster and mailed it to policymakers. So it was a very direct political campaign. We've also collaborated with SAGE many times over the past, 10 years or so. And this is one of our most recent collaborations. They created a guide called How to Be an Ally to Transgender Older Adults. And these are just two, the cover and one page, but it was a much longer guide. And they essentially illustrated the entire guide with photographs from our project. So whenever we've had a chance to collaborate, we're always happy to do so. And as I mentioned, we spent 5 years making the work. We've spent the last 5 years exhibiting the work, disseminating it, putting it to use, and that's something we plan to continue going forward. So I'm going to pause my part there, and I'm going to wheel out of the screen here and turn it over to Vanessa. I'm going to pop that up. Let's see.
Let's see. Might be right here.
Okay.
There. Oh, then I can't see this up. Okay. Hi, everyone. Really pleased to be with you all here today. And I'm going to share about another aspect of our project that was derived mostly from the interviews that we did. And so first today, I'll talk to you about social isolation and loneliness among LGBTQ plus older adults, what we know about these experiences in this community. And then I will share some findings that I've worked on research-wise from the project. And I wanted to share, I was inspired when Jess was talking, they showed you a picture of John, who came to the exhibition in St. Louis, who hadn't had a chance to meet a lot of trans people in person. And I wanted to share that when I started this project with Jess, it was fun to be more in the art world, and I hadn't really conceived of the research potential in this project until the interview with John. We were down in Arkansas again, and we spent this very emotional, very intense, wonderful time with John, hearing about his life. And it was after that interview that I had the realization that while this was an art and humanities project, we were also generating important data. And so once I had that light bulb moment, I realized that there was a lot of potential here to also frame what we had as data that could be analyzed, and findings that could be disseminated to help professions like social work and other caring, helping professions to do their best work with LGBTQ plus people and trans people specifically. So first, I think it's important, which you're hitting at the down
Back on
button.
the screen and then hit.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Got it. So first, I think it's important to have a working understanding of these terms, social isolation and loneliness. When we refer to social isolation, we are often referring to a more objective, measurable absence of meaningful and sustained connections with other people. And when we refer to loneliness, we're usually referring to more of a perception of a lack of social connection. And we know that these two things are related, but in complicated ways. So one causal direction could be that social isolation leads to loneliness, which I would argue is probably the most common assumption. But people can experience loneliness even when they're not entirely isolated. And so having a clear distinction of these two concepts and understanding that their relationship is not unilateral and there's not a singular causal relation, I think is very important. So for some background, many people, Trey and Meyer, but many agree that by about 2030, there will be 5 million older adults over the age of 50 who will identify as LGBT in the US. And a recent study by my colleague, Karen Fredrickson Goldson, found, she did a survey of 2,560 LGBTQ plus older adults, and she found that 60% reported lacking companionship and 50% reported feeling isolated and or left out. So already we see, thank you. Already we see in this one small study of LGBTQ older adults, a very concerning finding that has our antenna up for things like social isolation and loneliness. And of course, the negative outcomes that can stem from that.
On the screen again. Then you'll be back. Yeah.
Thank you. So there are many reasons for social isolation and loneliness among LGBTQ plus older adults. First of all, they have lifetime experiences of discrimination, stigmatization, and oftentimes very violent oppression throughout their lives. The current cohort of LGBT older adults are twice as likely to live alone and 4 times less likely to have children than their non-LGBTQ plus peers. And what's important to note here is this is not necessarily a reflection of their desire. This is not necessarily the way they had hoped to live, but this reflects oftentimes rejection from families of origin, rejection after transition, and feeling a lack of support over the years. This is a generation that grew up pre-Stonewall, pre-gay civil rights movement. They felt less support in having children. And in fact, many people even had their custody of their children revoked because of their LGBTQ plus status. In addition, the AIDS crisis decimated many social networks, especially for gay men, but for many trans people and lesbians and bisexual people as well. You see the effects of that crisis now playing out for this older cohort. And 78%, AARP did a study specifically about LGBT aging, and they found that 78% of this group of older adults express concern about lacking adequate social support as they age. And
Hey, everybody, I think we're experiencing a little bit of a Zoom glitch here on my end, and I think on Tiffany's end too. Jess and Vanessa have frozen. So we're just going to give it a minute here and see if they can join us again. So thanks for your patience.
We think we may have had a brief internet blip.
Can you hear us?
Yay, you're back. Great.
Oh, so sorry. Okay, here we go.
And Vanessa, you were just at the end of the slide, the AARP data point. You were just there where we lost you.
Screen back.
So
here.
sorry about that.
Okay. Oh, hang on. Got the wrong thing.
Go back one slide.
There we go. Is that good?
Great. Yep. Thanks.
Okay, awesome.
Okay. So as I was concluding here about people's concern about social support as they age, this is well-founded in that homophobia and transphobia are really major problems in the aging network, things like senior centers, and also a very, very serious concern in long-term care, both in terms of people coming into people's homes for support and very much so in terms of residential long-term care, i.e. nursing homes. So now I want to talk a little more, even more specifically about trans older adults and the ways that they are especially vulnerable. Trans older adults are less likely than non-trans peers to have advanced directives or healthcare proxies. They have experienced very frequently cut off from families of origin and also chosen families. This can happen especially after a late life gender transition that might lead to divorce from a spouse or adult children cutting off relationships. And these are the fears that trans older adults have about later life and their well-being are very legitimate. Physical and emotional abuse and neglect is very common in nursing homes. And so I make this point so strongly because these are often framed in terms of trans older adults' fears, but their fears are really grounded in direct experiences that they have had vicariously. They hear through the grapevine what happens to people in long-term care. And it's especially concerning and problematic and scary. So now I will tell you, that was a little background about social isolation and loneliness, LGBT older adults, some of trans older adults' vulnerabilities. And now I'll tell you how I present what we've learned through this project in a more social science framework. So in taking the interviews from the project, separating them from their photographs and de-identifying them, I created what we would call a secondary data set, a secondary qualitative data set. This was made up of these in-depth biographical interviews. We conducted 86 interviews with 88 trans people because 2 of the interviews were conducted with couples where both person identified as trans. And what I have done in my work with many doctoral students at WashU is carried out several interpretive content analyses. For those of you that are familiar with research methods, you may be familiar with the notion of content analysis. And content analysis, in some of its original formations, oftentimes use quantitative methods of analysis, for example, counting the number of times that someone used a word or a phrase. And interpretive content analysis does pay attention to the frequency with which a topic comes up, but it also seeks to dive deeper into the meaning and the nuance of what people are sharing, and then to contextualize what they have shared and to develop concepts and theory from these narratives. And so I conducted 4 studies so far based on these interviews, and I'm going to share with you a little bit about each one of these studies. The first focused on stigma, the second on social capital, the third on suicide, and the fourth on spirituality. I cannot tell you why they all start with S, but I don't know what I'm going to do about the topic for the fifth one. I have this feeling I may feel like it needs to start with an S. We'll see how that goes. And here you see, before I move forward, here you see how I present the participants in this project for a research audience so they can get a sense of the demographic characteristics that we did note down before we did these interviews. So you'll see that we have a nice balance of participants between those who identified as trans feminine or trans women, or as trans masculine, trans men. And we did have a handful of non-binary participants. As Jess said, our age ranged from 50 to 90, with a lot more people between the 50 and 70 range. But to my knowledge, our project is the first to do in-depth interviews with trans older adults over 70, and especially I don't know of other projects that have interviewed people over 80. So even though those numbers are small, those stories are very significant, and we're happy to have that representation in the project. About 40% of our participants were people of color, and while we didn't make it to every state in the US, we did make it to every major geographic location. So first, I'm going to share with you about the study that focused on stigma. So stigma, there's a large body of literature in social sciences, psychological and social sciences about stigma. And many people agree that it's helpful to think about it as being experienced in multi-level ways. The individual level referring to a more intra-psychological process, how one thinks of oneself in either positive or negative terms. Interpersonal stigma, kind of capturing what happens in relationships, oftentimes in family or in the workplace, and structural stigma, which refers to laws and policies and cultural norms that are stigmatizing. And many people in this body of literature have talked about the key aspect of internalization processes, how we take messages and internalize messages we receive about ourselves in those early caregiving relationships, but then also in our social lives, that addressing the nature of these internalization processes is really key for promoting psychological well-being. And we found in this study that when trans older adults talk about the ways that they've experienced stigma, first, they do talk about these three levels: individual, interpersonal, and structural. And they talk about the importance of nurturing affirming and restorative relationships as a means of confronting self-imposed isolation. So what this looks like for many people's lives is that the world was such a stigmatizing and threatening place that people isolated themselves as a protective practice, but that as they have aged, being conscious of finding and nurturing these relationships that are non-stigmatizing is one way to combat this isolation and to improve quality of life as they age. We also found, this is a finding that Jess and I experienced in each individual interview, and then looking at the interviews as a whole, and it's a finding that came through in every study I've conducted on the interviews, that activism and engagement with trans communities and civic engagement, sometimes even to elected office, were ways that people consciously and actively combated structural stigma and structural oppression. And this engagement in a more activist, resistance-oriented way instilled people with a sense of agency and a sense of self-efficacy. So in a lot of ways, we saw people in later life, which I think is really important, in later life, taking charge of their own well-being and recognizing the way that society has, in my words, has failed them. But that consciousness and that self-propelled development played a key role in navigating and promoting a better quality of life in their later years. So that's a summary of our findings about stigma. And now I'd like to share a little bit about our study on social capital. Social capital, just like stigma, there's a huge body of literature, many different disciplines and historical and cultural perspectives on what this means. Two of the most well-known and often referenced are Bourdieu and Putnam's conceptualization of social capital. So in a nutshell, Bourdieu talked about social capital as collected resources of groups drawn upon by group members, and that the power of these groups shaped access to those resources. And Putnam had a slightly different conceptualization of social capital. He saw social capital as a characteristic of social cohesion and the degree of connection and shared norms and trust within a society. So Bourdieu is a little bit more focused on groups and how they accessed power and conferred resources to its members. And Putnam talked a little bit more about social capital as a characteristic of society. So we looked at these two main conceptualizations of social capital and looking at the interviews and how trans older adults talked about the ways that they were able to access resources and facilitate some degree of connection in their lives, we found they talked about it in slightly different ways. So trans older adults we talked about being, one, marginalized from traditional forms of social capital, the ways that one might develop, both from Bourdieu and Putnam's perspective, might develop social capital through advancing in the workplace. Well, we know trans people experience high rates of employment discrimination. So that's one example of a way that traditional social capital that many people have access to, it looks different for trans older adults. And so based on their interviews, it seemed that they were left to generate their own social capital. And so we referred to this process of people using their own social networks and what some people call subworlds. Subworlds referring to trans networks, trans and sometimes broader LGBT networks, as ways to generate social and cultural capital outside of these normative or traditional pathways in which trans people were excluded. And one of the really fun parts of being a social scientist, I think, is coming up with new terms and naming things. And so my colleague and I named this authenticated social capital, and it refers to the way that trans older adults are conscious of the ways they've been excluded and actively work to generate social capital within trans communities as they age. The fourth paper and study that we conducted focused on the topic of suicide. So as some background first, there are high rates of suicide attempts and terribly high rates of success for trans people of all ages. And we went into this project knowing that fact. What we found were that trans older adults who shared with us their stories of surviving a suicide attempt, we realize they can offer such valuable insight into survival and resilience, and the way they made meaning of those experiences seemed valuable for lessons about aging well, but also could potentially offer some insight for younger trans people as well. And so we focused on the 12 participants in To Survive on the Shore that did narrate and share with us their suicide attempts. There could have been more, but our questions were more open-ended and the interviews were open-ended. And these were the people that chose to prioritize that aspect of their story with us. And after looking just at these 12 interviews, my colleagues and I found that people often talked in terms of impossibility and possibility, and what we ended up calling impossible versus possible paths to capture the perceptions of opportunity and potential related to suicidality and recovery. Oftentimes people talked about their thinking leading up to a suicide attempt, and they use things like impossible, there's nowhere to go, I have no options. And they talked about either aborting or compromising their suicide attempt mid-attempt when they had a moment of enlightenment or a moment of having a broader vision for what is possible for their lives. So that notion of possibility and that there could be something else than what I'm experiencing, that sometimes interrupted a suicide attempt. And then other people were grateful that they were not successful and used that experience as a way of actively creating more possibilities for themselves as they aged. And we hope that concept of these paths and that this paper, again, can be especially helpful to younger trans people who might be struggling with suicidality. So I'll conclude in talking about spirituality. This was the most recent study that I conducted with several students. And I actually just presented this paper at the Gerontological Society of America last week. And It was well received, and a lot of spirituality researchers who hadn't thought a lot about trans aging were there. And it was a very satisfying experience to join with them in thinking about spirituality later in life. So again, there's a very broad literature on spirituality and its positive connection to health and well-being in later life. But for trans people, especially this cohort of older trans people, many experienced terrible conflicts with religious and spiritual communities early in life, oftentimes within their families of origin. And so trans older adults are known to have to renegotiate spiritual identities and practices in light of those conflicts and in light of their desire for more affirmation of their gender identities. And we found when looking through the articles, Jess and I were I think I could say surprised a little bit. We hadn't quite anticipated how many people would talk about spirituality and how many people in our project ended up becoming very involved in religious communities after they had kind of worked through and come to accept and nurture their gender identities. And what we found in analyzing the interviews is that some people talked about spirituality in implicit ways. This idea of implicit spirituality comes from Hodge, who talked about a transcendent feeling of meaning and purpose in one's life. So a lot of the people we interviewed talked about finding a love of work, feeling generative in their communities, having a belief in transformation. And they talked about meaning and purpose in ways that they didn't actually use the term spirituality. They didn't frame it as such, but that deep sense of finding meaning later in life, we interpreted as a form of implicit spirituality. And then, of course, as I mentioned, the people that were very explicitly involved in religious communities and as spiritual leaders talked about their spirituality very explicitly. They talked about their gender journeys as being ones that help them to connect more with either a higher power or a sense of a larger connection to the universe. And then many people talked about the responsibility and the joy that they felt in being a leader, working with young people, or helping spiritual or religious communities become more affirming and doing better outreach for trans older adults especially. So I will conclude there and look forward to taking questions with Jess about anything we have shared today.
Stop sharing.
Thank you both so much. I'm gonna go ahead and spotlight myself and join you here. There we go. Sorry about my weird lighting here. Thank you. That was just a brilliant presentation. Really loved every part of it. And the collaboration is something that I'm just so intrigued by. We don't really, in my opinion, get enough of this beautiful balance between the fine arts and the research, the social science research. It was so illuminating and just beautiful. There's a question I want to ask that I saw come in the chat about terminology. This was in relationship to Jude, the subject Jude, a descriptive term that our audience member hadn't heard and was not familiar with. And she is interested just in expanding her own knowledge about the way people prefer to be acknowledged. Do you remember what term you used, or does that come to mind?
Well, I mean, I guess the first thing that comes to mind is that people use such different language for themselves. And that's something we really tried to honor in the project, to just really use whatever language that people said. The other thing is that the language shifts really quickly. So, you know, for example, the project is called, Photographs and Interviews with Transgender and Gender Nonconforming Older Adults. And we wrestled with that nonconforming word. We knew it would change, and it already has. I mean, now,
and we originally were using gender variant before we published the book.
Right. And then it became gender nonconforming, and now I say gender expansive. That seems to be what's being said. So I guess for the audience, it's very hard to keep up because things change all the time. I think for Jude, I might have said transmasculine or trans man. Those are the words I probably would have used. I can't remember exactly what I said, but
I would recommend two things. I think if you'd like a little 101 on language, you can go, there's actually a great resource. It's Sage, and it is a essay and one kind of 101 training that they published on their website for grandparents of LGBTQ youth. And it's a very nice current overview of terms, because they kind of assume they're writing to people like, this is also new, but I want to support my grandchild. So I recently looked at that, and I would recommend going to Sage and looking grandparents with LGBT grandchildren. And it's a great current overview of terms. And then I would combine that, you can learn those terms. And then whenever in doubt, ask. Whenever in doubt, ask directly to a person or ask their representative. It's never impolite to ask someone what pronouns they use or what language they use to identify. It's actually quite respectful to admit you don't know instead of presuming. So it looks like someone may have just put that in the chat. Awesome.
Yes, great. Thank you so much, Tiffany, for that. And agreed. And also, what a shame that important conversations might not start because we feel shy about the words that we might use, So I appreciate that question to kick us off here. And we don't have too much time. I'm so sorry to say, because I would want to talk with you both and with the audience for much longer. But I do want to ask you something that we had sort of prepared in advance, because it selfishly helps us tee up our conversation tomorrow in our intergenerational day. So here's the question for both of you. And this is about the opportunity. You spoke a lot actually about the opportunity that you saw to position this work as a helpful documentation and exploration for younger generations of transgender people. What do you feel like has been the benefit that you've seen for the older adults that participated in that sort of intergenerational conversation?
That's a great question. I mean, this isn't a direct answer, but one of the first things that comes to mind is that we have shown the work a lot at university art museums, and young people have really resonated with it. I think it has struck them as powerful to see trans older adults. And one of the reasons we started the project is we heard from younger trans people that they had literally never seen a picture of an older trans person, and they had no roadmap for what their life would look like going forward. So that's been really powerful to see. It's resonating with very, very young folks, as well as older adults. The project was also designed to be validating for a trans audience and educational for a mainstream audience. And so that's been a duality that's been really wonderful too. And I would say for the older adults who participated, I think so many of them participated because they wanted to give back and they wanted to pay it forward. And so I think that experience has often been very rewarding for them. And especially when they can really participate in exhibitions or, meet people that the work is affecting. And we've also heard several cases where being in the project really helped their family come to understand. Some very powerful stories from specific people about how significant that was. So I think there's influence in all directions, and we're always trying to increase like intergenerational learning.
And I would add two things to that. One of the first questions I get asked when I present to fellow researchers, just this week, I got this question. First question was, oh my gosh, it's always so hard to find people from hard to reach populations. Quotes are very intentional there. How in the world did you find 88 people? And I said, we could have interviewed 500 people. Because when your research questions or when a project like this aligns with people's own desire to connect and be seen, it really was actually an issue. We couldn't actually interview as many people who wanted to. So I think from a research perspective, it challenges the notion that we're taking something from someone, right? They're wanting to give, and that process of giving is good for their well-being. And then I would just add to that as well, in terms of thinking of the impact for all older adults. When I get asked sometimes to write like a Trans 101 thing I just worked with our local NORC, naturally occurring retirement community here, for a 101 on trans aging. Instead of presenting facts of trans older adults, I asked all people to think about their gender and sexuality. In what ways do you feel like your gender constricted what you were able to do? right? So of course, women are going to talk about growing up in the 40s and 50s. And, sometimes I try to use our project to help people see that we all have gender identity, we all have sexuality, and the world that trans people live in is the world we all live in. So that's one offshoot of that I think can resonate with just all older adults.
That's so poignant, because I remember in our Creative Aging Institute last year, we had a really wonderful afternoon training on basically ageism 101. And one of the topics that our excellent presenters brought forth was the question of sexuality and aging. Just that in and of itself could be a conversation that we barely want to tiptoe into. So I love and appreciate just your opening up gender identity, sexuality, like just as a topic for all older adults to remember that is valid and important to our vitality, no matter the age,
Right. And that was something we really intentionally wanted to include in this work too. Like in Duchess's portrait, she really brought that forth, and Sky really wanted to wear leather. He was very active in the leather scene in the Bay Area and like really wanted to bring that to the image. So that's something we welcomed, and it's certainly in the texts as well, like overt references to sexuality. Again, pushing back against this assumption that after a certain age you like decline. It's like, no, people are robust and complicated and growing and evolving, but we were very intentional about bringing that in.
Wonderful, wonderful. Let me just divert my attention here 1 second to look at the chat, because I want to make sure I'm not missing anything along the way as we bring it a little bit to a close. I see a lot of kudos and thanks for the beautiful work and collaboration. And Alan has a question: in the renegotiation of faith and spiritual awareness, what did you find about your subjects that identify with more self-discovery versus being part of a plan that gave meaning to life and connection to life in general? So maybe, Alan, I'm interpreting your question here a little bit, but can you say a little bit more about what spirituality means? Is it self-discovery? Is it bigger picture in life? Is it overt religiosity? What did you find for most people that you interviewed?
Broadly speaking, I think people talked about feeling connected. And some people talked about feeling connected to a sense of a higher power. But some people just oftentimes talked about nature. Many people, John, for example, and several others, walked in nature every day, took nature walks and hiked. And so I think it was mostly about connection. And then I think it was about giving oneself permission to feel, sometimes in the name of God or in a particular faith tradition, affirming oneself in the world, I would say, broadly speaking, around spirituality.
Yeah. And we did also, quite a few of the participants were ministers or, some kind of organized religious leader. And many of them spoke about that path, again, as a way to give back. Like they felt that they had been through so much, and now that they were on the other side, they wanted to give back and create this kind of loving, affirming space for other people. So that, at least for me, there were far more ministers than I anticipated. We had quite a few, and it was really, really wonderful.
I love hearing that. We had also last year in our Creative Aging Institute, we heard about the sort of theoretical work. I can't remember the name of the person, but this idea of gerotranscendence, that when we get it, rather than a kind of developmental decline in older age, we're actually like transcending limitations. We're finding our full expression of gifts, and the idea that spirituality would be that makes so much sense. My friends, like I said, I could talk for hours about this, but I do need to bring it to a close. So Jess and Vanessa, thank you for your work. Thank you for your participation. And I hope we can stay in touch. I think Tiffany's going to bring into the chat your website. So the Survive on the Shore website, so folks can keep track of you and the work.
Great. And thank you so much for having us. And thank you all for coming today.
Yes, thank you very much.
Real pleasure. Speak soon.
Right. Bye.
Bye.